Sir Stephen Runciman has been the leading British Byzantine historian for over half a century. But his reputation also rests on his history of the Crusades and related works such as the Sicilian Vespers. His history of the Crusades is by far the best general history of the Crusades written in English, and his influence on English Crusade studies has been enormous. Several generations of historians brought up on his history and inspired by it have in fact led to England now being one of the leading centres of Crusade studies. Sir Stephen, your interest in history dates back to your childhood, I think.
Well, I think, although most historians have probably started by being romantic children, brought up on romantic fairy stories and on such easy histories as Our Island Story.
Yes, I do.
And that starts one's imagination working. And we begin to want to know about the past and about these glamorous characters who seem so much more interesting than the people you read about in the newspapers today.
But it clearly, in your case, was more than that. I mean, you clearly were a very studious child. I mean, your knowledge of languages at a relatively early age was quite extraordinary for the time.
Well, I was very lucky as a child in having an extremely good governess, a good Highland lady who'd been brought up herself bilingual, which she brought up in a Gaelic atmosphere, and who was a wonderful linguist. She was absolutely bilingual in French and in German, and she had a passion for the classics. She started me off with Latin when I was 6, and then she wanted French. I don't remember beginning to learn, but Latin when I was 6. Then when I was 7, she started me off on German and Greek. But I rather took against German, but I took very much for Greek. And so that gave me a start, which wasn't much delayed when I went to school.
And when did you learn Russian? Because that you knew by the time you were...
When I was 11, I decided that I wanted to read Russian. And so my mother arranged, it was the beginning of the First World War, and there was an Anglo-Russian society. My mother arranged for an excellent Russian lady, who became one of our best family friends, to come and teach me Russian. Well, I've never had enough practice to learn to speak Russian properly, but I did learn to read it. And that I am very grateful for having done.
Do you think that contributed to the interest that developed in you in Orthodoxy and Eastern Christianity?
I think I was interested in Greek, and I preferred the Greek. I admired the Latin language, but I preferred the Greek language, and that and Russian, I think, did turn my sympathies very much to Eastern Europe.
You said, you've written somewhere that it was reading Walter Scott's Count Robert of Paris that sort of made you interested in Byzantine history, and that you were so dissatisfied with the account given by Walter Scott that you wanted to find what the truth was.
Well, I think that is in a way true, and I think one ought to write a study on the works that inspire you by irritating you. And certainly Walter Scott, I thought, got medieval history pretty wrong, and I didn't believe that Byzantium, such as he depicted it in Count Robert of Paris, I didn't believe that could be right. And I still think that I am really more right than he is over there.
So what did you do? You went then started to read?
I started to read. And that made me read, for instance, Anna Komnina, whom he quotes and misquotes. And it very much helped in my interest in Byzantium. But that, I think, been going anywhere altogether.
Was this when you... Sorry.
And partly, perhaps, because I rather liked taking on something that no one else seemed to be interested in. And at that time, no one much in this country was interested in Byzantium.
Was this while you were still at Eton?
While I was still at Eton. And I was able to read quite a lot then. It never appeared in what I was officially supposed to be learning, but I had spare time. I mean, the good luck of being rather ill, so that I didn't have to play games and could go to the school library instead. And so my interest developed all the more in that I felt, rather arrogantly perhaps, I was being something of a pioneer.
And so then, after Eton, you came up to Cambridge as an undergraduate, and were you at that stage, as an undergraduate, able to pursue your interest?
Very little, and the Cambridge had really got no room for Byzantine studies. No, in the medieval history papers, there were perhaps one or two questions that dealt with Byzantine figures who were world figures like Justinian, but not much else. However, I managed, by just doing my vague duty of bits of history I had to learn, I managed to amuse myself by reading more and more about history that I wanted to learn.
Did anyone who was supervising you at the time, encourage you at all?
No one supervised me at the time, but when I got my degree, when I wanted to do research, there was in Cambridge a professor, the Regis professor, Professor J.B. Bury, who started life as a classicist, but ended up as a Byzantinist. He was in residence in Cambridge, but old and frail, and notorious. He didn't like pupils. He'd had one or two in his earlier days when he'd been a professor in Dublin, hadn't cared for them. And when it was suggested to him that he might take me on as a pupil, it didn't go down at all well with him, but he agreed at last to see me. He was very discouraging, saying that very few people were fitted to deal with Byzantine history, and certainly it was no good trying unless you could read Slavonic languages. So I piped up bravely saying, but I can read Russian. And at that his whole attitude changed, and he took an interest in me and suggested, of talking a bit, what period I should study. And at the end of the interview, he said, well, if you read Russian, you can manage this. And he took from his shelves 2 enormous volumes in Bulgarian, saying that there was an article by Professor Zlatarsky in each of those. You go and read them and come back in a fortnight and tell me what you think. Well, Bulgarian is fairly like Russian. I can't say I could read them entirely because there wasn't a single dictionary from Bulgarian into any Western language in the whole of Cambridge. But I made sense of them, sufficiently to satisfy him. And after that, he was very encouraging, but really not through any help, part of his, not very helpful, because he was very seldom in his professorial rooms in King's, if I wrote a note to him to his house, I never got an answer, and I was very puzzled why, till someone told me, oh, but Mrs. Bury doesn't like him being bothered with letters. She destroys them. And eventually, most of my supervision was done because I discovered he went for a walk on the backs every afternoon, and I would waylay him with a notebook and a pencil and ask him the questions I wanted, and I think he quite enjoyed that. But I had very little time, because after 1 year, which I was away quite a lot being ill, he retired with illness, and so I really had only 1 year, and after that, I had to go on without any supervisor.
No one at all.
No, I'm autodidact in that way.
Amazing. Yes.
And, well.
Did the thesis that you were writing was on Romanus Lecca?
It was on Romanus Lecca, yes.
And then, but of course, when that came out, very shortly afterwards, your book on the First Bulgarian Empire came out. The two presumably came out of the work.
Well, the Bulgarian part was, I'd done a sort of appendix on Bulgarian history for my fellowship thesis.
Ah, yes.
And so I filled that up to make it a separate book soon after. And that was rather interesting doing it, because that I had to do more or less myself. Because there was no Western, well, one book in German by a Czech historian. It was the only Western book that dealt with the subject.
Oh, it was a pioneering book, and so was the Byzantine civilization, which I don't think really there'd been anything quite like that before.
Yes, but I think it's rather a bad book. I'm a bit ashamed of that Byzantine civilization. I thought I knew more than I did.
After this, of course, you became a Fellow of Trinity.
Yes.
And it must have been sometime during the time that you were Fellow that you began to think of the Crusades.
Yes, I'd always half had that in mind, really, from childhood. But there were various things. I wanted to get some Byzantine things done first. And then I also did a book on the dualist heresies,
yes,
which rather written out of my Bulgarian book. And then I felt free to settle down to the Crusades. And I was very lucky during the war, because I was in the Middle East all the time, and I was able to go over a great deal of the crusading territory.
This was when you became professor in Turkey, and before that?
Yes. Before that I'd been stationed for a time in Cairo and stationed for a time in Jerusalem. And then when I was in Turkey as a professor, my holidays were all spent in Syria or Lebanon.
It was Guy Burgess who got you out into the East first.
When the war started, I was recovering from a very bad attack of amoebic dysentery. I mean, I was saved by a German drug they managed to get over just before the war broke out. So that none of the armed forces would look at me. But my first pupil, who was the traitor Guy Burgess, was by then working, I suppose the orders of his Soviet masters, in the British Ministry of Information on the Near Eastern desk, or East European desk. And there they wanted someone who could deal with Bulgaria, and he knew that I could read Bulgarian. So my war career, when I was ready to take on a war career, was first 3 or 4 months at the Ministry of Information. Then they sent me out as a press attaché to Bulgaria, and I was away from Britain for 5 years, never came back.
This was in Bulgaria first, and then Cairo.
Then I was in Cairo, dealing with broadcasting from the various Balkan languages. then in Jerusalem for a time, where my two main jobs, both of them rather delightful. One was censor, film censor for Palestine. I hardly allowed them to see anything. And the other was sort of government liaison for publicity with various heads of the religions, which of course Jerusalem abounds. I enjoyed that and was rather disappointed when I was summoned off to become a professor in Turkey.
And throughout all this period, the Crusades were sort of brewing, was
The
it?
Crusades were brewing, and I was sort of taking notes of the places I saw. And,
but the reading behind the Crusades is absolutely immense. That must have been done after the war or started before the war?
Well, a little during the war, but after during the war, one didn't have time or really libraries.
Yes, yes.
And particularly when I was in Istanbul as a professor, the only good library was in the German Institute, which naturally I couldn't consult. Robert College had not a bad library, but nothing really profound. So most of the really steady reading had to wait till I got home.
And you got home, what, in 1946, was it?
1947.
47, oh yes.
I retired from Istanbul in 45. I'd been rather ill that year, so they were quite glad to get rid of me. And I spent 2 years setting up the British Council in Greece, which was very useful for getting to know all the Greek side of things.
Yes, yes.
And then I was home and could concentrate on Crusades, and I thought there's a lot to read.
A tremendous amount to read. Did you, once the Crusades was written, I mean, after that you did, I mean, before you'd written the Crusades, you had more or less concentrated on Byzantine history.
Yeah.
But once the Crusades were over, you did write on Western things as well as Eastern things. I'm thinking of the Eastern Schism, which combines both, or the Sicilian Vespers. So that you were then really spanning both Latin and Greek.
I think one shouldn't just try and span one. And you've got to remember the correlation of Eastern and Western civilization, Christian civilization. And after all, I find them both very interesting.
Did you, you've written in a very interesting essay published by the Royal Society of Literature that for you, history is in the end literature as well as the science of history. I mean, you see the end product as being a literary as well as a, one broader sense, scientific one.
Well, it rather disappoints me that if you go back 2 centuries only, the great historical work was an important literary event. Gibbon, for instance, and later on Macaulay, and even Carlyle. Now, a lot of you historians seem almost ashamed of writing good literature. Some of you do in spite of yourselves, but it rather distresses me that admirable society, the Pen Club, once asked me to join, but the Pen stands for Poetry, Essays and Novels. It was all right. I said I wouldn't join a society that dropped its H's. Where was history? However, they did once give me a silver medal, so I can't.
No.
Silver pen, so I can't complain.
How do you set about the process? I mean, you pick on a topic which interests you, sparking something from perhaps from a long way apart, but then do you focus on any particular on people or ideas or?
Well, the first thing I think is to try and find the original sources. and go through them, that begins to shape your mind and your interests.
Yes.
And but all the same, my interest in history, I must confess, is very largely the personal, the character, the historical characters, which means that my interest is, in a way, rather snobbish, because after all, the characters we know about in history are the eminent. And the Muse Clio is a terrible snob. I would gladly know more about the lesser people, but it's difficult to find much about them.
But so in that particular stage, I mean, you're drawn to the characters and you're reading about them and making up your mind about them out of the reading, and then there comes a point at which you feel that your ideas about them should be communicated in a form which is, you've said in one of your books, epic.
Well, I think that it's rather important to start writing the book fairly early on, because after all, as that great historian Huizinga said, how can you make the sources give you the answers you want unless you know what questions to ask?
Yes.
And I think you've got it's by trying to arrange things for writing, the questions then come clear in your mind. And so I think one must always have the written thing in mind in order to get the information you want.
You have written about, in I think the second of the essays that the Royal Society for Literature published, about the epic quality that is in good history.
Yes. Well, I think there is a sort of epic quality. And I think I rashly wrote in the preface to my Crusades that Homer as well as Herodotus were the fathers of history. And I do believe very much that history gets across much better if it is literature. But I don't know. Maybe by turning it into literature, one takes too many shortcuts. That is possible.
Another thing that you have defended in history is what you've called the romantic imagination.
Yes. Well, I think you need imagination for history, but of course it's a very dangerous thing, imagination. It's got to be very well controlled. And in a way, it's one of the agonies of writing history is that you do want to loosen the controls of your imagination. And sometimes you think how nice it would be to write a historical novel. But actually I don't think it would be, because I think one wants, in a way, the discipline of sources.
Yes, yes. Which of your historical works has pleased you most? I mean, in retrospect.
It's very difficult to say. I think my best book about Byzantium, it's a paperback I published called Byzantine Style and Civilization. Yes. That rather pleased me because I thought on the whole I'd summarized fairly well, though I must say when I looked at it last, I wasn't so sure. Otherwise, it's a little difficult to say. I enjoyed very much writing a book on post-Byzantium, on the Greek son of the Turks. That was, in a way, rather untrodden territory.
Your range is enormous because there is that book on the patriarchate after the Ottoman conquest, but then you've also written about the 19th century and Borneo and the...
well, I was asked, and I thought it was probably good for one, do something out of one subject. And I wrote on the White Rajas of Borneo, largely because the White Rajas seemed to me rather crusading characters, and the White Ranis seemed to me like the worst type of Byzantine empress. But I didn't like writing about modern history because you can't really say what you think without being rude, ungallant, or rendering yourself liable to libel actions.
Yeah.
So that I shall never write about modern history again. And now I'm writing my memoirs. I'm going to stop at 1939, hoping that most people I write about will be dead.
So you won't be covering your history of the Crusades?
No.
Is that the reason? I mean, that the people will be can't be
nobody
offended.
minds being told that their grandparents were rather villainous or rather ridiculous, but you mustn't say that about their parents.
Yes.
So, I'm old enough to keep to the grandparental generation.
Do you find writing easy?
I used to. Now, in old age, it's well, I suppose it's simply that one tires more quickly. One can't concentrate so long.
Are you one of those people who write a page and don't have to alter it, or one of those who make lots and lots of corrections?
No, I do most of my writing in my head. Walking in the country, that sort of thing. I then type out on an old-fashioned typewriter with a certain number of misprints, but not very many, and very few alterations, and it's mostly the first draft I send to the publishers.
Yes. Well, I mean, the speed with which if you think those 3 volumes on the Crusades were produced, I mean, if you got back from the war in 1947 and the first volume came out 4 years later, didn't it, in 1951?
First one, yes.
That is astonishingly productive.
Well, I wasn't doing anything else, so to speak.
It's still, nevertheless, it is a remarkable speed of production. Did you, let's say, I'm concentrating on that because this span is so great over the 3 volumes. Yeah. When you began writing on volume 1, which is, after all, dedicated really to the First Crusade and the immediate period before the Crusade, did you already have in your mind volume 3 and the 13th century onwards?
More or less, but not in detail. In outline, but not in detail. No, the first volume, because on the whole, was the easiest to do, because it was a straightforward, fairly limited story. Second volume was, in a way, the least rewarding to do, because so much of it was just internal struggles or local struggles and that sort of thing. The third volume took one rather almost too widely. And when you found yourself having to deal with the Mongols.
Yes, yes.
That sort of thing.
Yes. Do you, I mean, what do you feel about the way history has gone in the last, I suppose last 50 years? I mean...
Well, I do find a lot of it rather unreadable, I must confess. I mean, I think the standards of research have gone up. That is, on the whole, very well. But it doesn't always mean that the results are readable. Yes. And I think if the results are readable, they're rather wasted. Yes. And after all, the point of writing books is that they should be read.
Yes.
I mean, that Hilaire Belloc epigram, which when I am dead, may this of me be said, his sins were scarlet, but his books were red. And I think that one does rather hope that one's books will be read.
Yes. Why do you think it is that history has become less
Because
readable?
I think it's for the admirable reason that people are taking research more seriously, which is a very good thing.
How does that lead to the books being? You mean they're not concentrating enough on
Well,
the
they
literary
get
side?
rather lost in the detail,
Yes.
and they're so anxious that every detail is right. Which I think some of us do occasionally take risks in history. We may not detail, and you can't find what you think the detail is, so you have to improvise. And I suppose that is really wrong, but it does help the writing of history.
Do you think the picture has changed of the past? Do you think it's less romantic? I mean, I share with you this romantic image of the Middle Ages. Do you think there are people now who don't, who have a more sort of, I don't know what you call it, but...
Yeah, but I think the historians seem not to share our view, but the readers do.
Yes.
And after all, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Proof of the book is in the reading of it.
Well, I should like to thank Sir Stephen Runciman very much for giving up the time to give us his views on history. Now we start talking.